Thank you for joining me on this episode of Grieving Voices. Today, I'm excited to have author Annie Sklar Orenstein. She is a qualitative researcher, oral historian, and storyteller who has spent over a decade collecting stories from people around the world. Her work has been featured on NBC Nightly News, Comedy Central, Huffington Post, Politico, Time, and Motherly. In Always a Sibling, The Forgotten Mourners Guide to Grief, Annie uses her own story and those of others to create the empathic, thoughtful, practical resource that surviving siblings so desperately need. And I did read it, and thank you so much for sharing your work with the world. And what was eye-opening for me, even just early on in the first few couple chapters, I was like, I never really thought about how our relationship with our sibling is the longest relationship we have. Never
Yeah.
really looked at it like that. So thank you for that awareness that you brought to me, amongst many other things, according to my notes. um, but I really enjoyed the book, and I really do feel like it's a wonderful asset for people who have lost a sibling. I personally have not lost a sibling, but I tell you, just reading the book, I thought about my sister and my brother a lot, obviously, my siblings, but I'm very tight with my sister. She's 9 years older than me and, was like my second mom and has, kind of been the motherly figure in my life for much of my life. So,
hmm
yeah, the bond, right? The sibling bond. They know your childhood like nobody else. That's very true.
They do. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting, there are a lot of stats that I learned and that I heard that really stuck with me. And one of, I guess, two that really resonated with me and I think really like encapsulate this is that uh, siblings spend more time together in childhood than they do with their parents. And that more people, I believe this is a US stat, but more people grow up in a household with siblings than with fathers. And I look at my own kids, they're 6 and 9. They absolutely spend more time together than with me, and after school, they're with a sitter or they're at after school, but they're together. They share a room. And after I leave at night, they don't fall right to sleep. I wish they fell right to sleep, but there's chattering and there's stuff going on. And they absolutely, you know, know things about each other that I don't know. There will be times where, my daughter tells me something and I'm surprised to hear it. And my son is like, I've known that for weeks. And it's true. It's how families function. It's not like a judgment. It's just it's how families function. It's how things work. And so regardless of, in adulthood, whether or not you have a good relationship or a bad relationship, or, as most are somewhere in the middle, that time together and that, kind of pressure cooker relationship, it impacts you. It makes you who you are in many, many ways.
Yes, and that was like I had so many ahas when as I was reading and today we're talking about Ben, and that's what your book is about, is the loss of your brother. And the one question I had early on in the book is, I'm a veteran and I was in the National Guard. Your brother was in the reserves.
Mhm.
And one of the questions I had early on in my notes was, what made him enlist in the first
Ooh,
place?
it's a great question. Um, and I asked him that no shortage of times. Um, he so there were a few things. Eh, One is that he had some political aspirations. He wasn't like necessarily sure if he would run for office, but maybe he would work for a politician or something like that. And he had a very strong kind of drive for service. And he felt like if he was going to do that, he should have a military background, and that having a military title would help him. He studied international affairs and diplomacy at Fletcher, and he worked for the CDC and for FEMA, and he really felt like, you know, having that credential would help him. It was when he enlisted, it was 2000. So this was pre 9/11. They paid for him to go to grad school. You know, they paid for Fletcher, and he got the officer title. And then, you know, the second piece of it is that he had this idea that is, I mean, you tell me, but logical-ish to me, that NGO, there are places that the Army can go and can work and can help that aren't even accessible to NGOs. And the Army has these incredible resources and huge amounts of money. And he felt like if he was on the inside, he could use that to go into these places that really needed help, and he could help them. And so on the one hand, it was kind of a strategic move. And on the other hand, it was like, and while I'm here, I actually think I can make change from the inside and do all of this good work. And that was, you know, ultimately what he was, a civil affairs officer. And that was ultimately, you know, kind of what he was working towards was a lot of infrastructure projects. And he did, on his first deployment in Africa, they were bringing clean water and building wells, and he ended up forming a nonprofit when he got home to continue that work. So it was really a combination of things. But I will tell you that when, you know, on 9/11 and when those towers went down, that was when I started to be terrified. And I thought, like, why did you just do this? You know, he had finished boot camp so I guess it was 2001. He had finished boot camp in August. And then the Twin Towers went down. And it was very quickly, we were like, oh, this is not going to be what you thought it was.
We're pretty close in age, Ben and I, actually. And, but I want you to mention the nonprofit he started, because I'm kind of wondering, just even reading the book, you alluded to that it's still going, but what happened?
It was
because it's called Clearwater Initiative.
Clearwater Initiative. It was absorbed eventually after a few. My parents ran it for a few years, and it was then absorbed by another clean water NGO, or absorbed. I don't know what the right word is. Like, it's not like it was bought, but it was like
absolved.
Yeah. So they're still, you know, continuing the work, but it's not run by our family anymore. It's International Lifeline Fund, I believe, is what the larger organization is called, that has since kind of absorbed it and is running the project.
Now, we haven't mentioned when he actually passed and how long it's been since you wrote the book and all of that. Can we kind of rewind a little bit? And then I kind of want to fast forward again to that mission that you initially had after he passed, to give up your own dreams to pursue his. And so kind of, yeah, let's rewind the clock and then kind of fast forward again.
Yes, of course. So rewind the clock to when he passed. So he was deployed to Afghanistan in July of 2009. And he was killed on October 2nd of 2009. So it was almost, I think, just shy of 3 months into his deployment. And he was a civil affairs officer, and so they obviously dealt a lot with civilians, community leaders, and what we've been told, and I've since spoken to men in his unit, is that there was what he thought was, a meeting with a local community leader, and they were out on foot, and that was kind of part of it. Was they would go out on foot and all of these things because they didn't want to be threatening. They didn't want to like show up to a meeting with a local leader in a tank, right? So they show up on foot. The village was pretty empty, like in hindsight, suspiciously empty. But they got to where they were supposed to meet this person and walked around to the back of the building, and there was a suicide bomber just waiting for them. And my brother, who was the captain of their unit, and then one other soldier in the unit and their translator were all killed.
And so receiving that news.
Yeah. So I was, it surprised me at the time and still does, but like just how quickly they got the news to us, it was that day. My parents had always said things like, no news is good news. And in, leading up to that point, any period of not hearing anything, I found really terrifying. And then I realized just how quickly there were soldiers showing up at my parents' doorstep. And I realized no news is good news, because if there's bad news, they find you. So that night, it was a Friday, and my other brother, my brother Sam, had a 1-year-old, and who is now about to turn 16, which is wild. And I was babysitting. I was babysitting my nephew. I had just, he was asleep. I had ordered dinner, and I was sitting in my brother's apartment, and the front door opened. And my first thought was, why does the delivery guy have a key to their apartment? That's weird. And I kind of stood up to go walk over and see what was going on. And my brother and sister-in-law were standing there, and they did not look okay. And my first thought was, they must have gotten in a fight, and now they're home. And literally my first thought was like, oh, am I still gonna get this sushi, or like, am I gonna have to leave? And like, do I wait for the delivery guy? Like,
If
it
only.
just, it really, I don't know how their faces didn't freak me out more, but they just kind of sandwiched me in a hug. And my brother Sam said, it's Ben. And I said, he's okay, right? And Sam said, no, Ben's gone. And I remember sitting on their couch and kind of rocking and just saying, this was not supposed to happen. This was not supposed to happen. And, the kind of chain of events, my dad had gotten home, and there were soldiers on the doorstep. According to our neighbors, they had been there for a few hours, just waiting. And, my parents ultimately called Sam and my other brother, and I was living alone at the time, and so they were planning to drive into New York City to tell me, because they were nervous about me getting the news, alone in my apartment. And Sam said to them, she's sitting on my couch. I'll go tell her. So he had to come home and tell me. And my brother Ben was engaged at the time, and his fiance's house was kind of in the middle of where we lived and where my parents lived. So we all met there. And then I went back home with my parents. And, my, it just felt like everything kind of crumbled in that moment, right? Like I was sitting there waiting for like dinner delivery. I was babysitting my nephew. And then the next thing I knew, I was, a few hours later, I was back in my childhood home and we were figuring out who's going to drive to Dover to meet the transport plane and who's going to tell our grandma who's, mid 90s and just the speed of it all was really surprising to me. The speed at which they got him home, the speed at which we got the news, like um, it all happened very fast, especially considering that it happened very, very far away.
I like to I not like to, but I kind of think of trauma as too much, too soon, too fast.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
how our minds can ruminate on that, on just getting the news, right? And what was
Mm-hmm.
happening. And then it's like later, it's like a complete blur. I, having been deployed, you never, I mean, it's like, we're busy, right? We're busy doing things and doing the mission every day. And to think about the family sitting at home, right? We don't know that side of it. My husband was
Mm-hmm.
too at the same time. So it was like we had a lot of family that was probably losing sleep and wondering if they were going to get a knock on the door. We did lose 3 men on our deployment, and because we cleared roadside bombs, that's what we did, and I was a medic. So um, yeah, that's the other side of the coin, that the families sacrifice too. The families suffer too, and um, so um, yeah, I just, you don't go on deployment thinking you're not going to come home, but you definitely know that's a possibility, right? And every day,
Mm-hmm.
the wire, you think, is today the day. And
Mm-hmm.
um,
I think about too when you were saying like too much too fast, like I think about some of the like phone calls or things that I thought were like really important, in that moment. Like I remember when I was done babysitting, I was going to meet up with a friend who was in town, who, lived elsewhere. And I think I texted her something like, I'm not gonna make it out tonight. My brother was just killed in Afghanistan, and like I called, um, I was in grad school and we had like a Saturday workshop. And I was really nervous to call the head of my program to tell her I wasn't going to make it the next day, And like it, I just I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know what I was doing, I think there was a part of me that felt like this is the beginning and this is about to get really crazy. Like as soon as I get home, as soon as I am with my parents, as soon as whatever, like a lot of things are going to happen very quickly and I need to just make sure no one expects anything of me, in hindsight, like I could have just not shown. I could have just said like something came up, I'm not going to be there, or just not responded at all, like. But um, now I think about being on the receiving, like what would I have done if I had gotten that text from someone? Like, what do but you're just like, it felt like methodical. Like I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that I shouldn't stand someone up. I knew that I shouldn't just skip class. So like, let me just let these people know, and then I can fall apart and do all of these other things. Um, but yeah, in hindsight, I was like, man, I knew enough to do those few little things, even though I genuinely, aside from that, I felt like I had no idea what was going on.
it's almost as if the world stands still and then it's spinning around and then yours stands still and it's like everyone else is moving. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah,
And there was like
time
no real
more.
filter for a while. Like, you know, I couldn't think straight enough to even like filter myself. Um, this is a terrible story, but I volunteered to go tell my grandmother, who was a character. She was very mean, but we all loved her. And everyone else went to Dover, and I get car sick. And the idea of sitting in an 11-passenger van and driving from Connecticut to Delaware and back in one day so that I could see this casket move planes was too much. Like that, I something about the idea of being in that van, and knowing I would be sick the whole time. Like I couldn't do it. So I said, I'll go tell grandma. And I told my grandma, I said, Ben was killed in Afghanistan. She said, what? Ben was killed in Afghanistan. And she kept saying what? And I kept saying it louder. And my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, is like just standing off to the side, clearly doesn't know what to do, as I'm just saying this over and over. And my grandma says, again, she's in her mid-90s, and my grandma says, it should have been me. And I said, I know. Who says that? Except, yes, she was in her mid-90s. Yeah, but we all thought she would be the next one to go. Um, and I think about that all the time, that she said it should have been me. And I said, I know. And she didn't bat an eye, like she didn't think it was weird. It was probably the most honest thing I've ever said. But there was just no filter left. There was no, it was all I could do just to go through the motions. And to try to, I don't know, to try to be gentle about anything was just, I think, more than I could do.
That brings up anger for me in your book. You devote like a whole chapter to it and the role of anger. And I'm curious what you would say to this, but what did anger reveal to you about your grief?
A good question. I think a lot of times anger was like the proof that I was not okay.
Mm.
You know, I'm an emotional person. I'd been an emotional person. I'm an anxious person. I'm not an angry person. Anger was new for me. Um, and it and that made it really scary because, if I was feeling anxious or nervous, okay, I felt this before. If I was feeling sad or lonely, okay, I felt this before. But the anger, you know, everything else was a heightened emotion. The anger felt like a new emotion, scary emotion. And I couldn't say, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know, how to channel it or where to put it. And so I, it made me feel very out of control, and made me feel like I can't like pretend I'm okay because this is like not okay. And it would be very sudden, as anger can be. And I just I didn't expect it to be as intense as it was. I didn't think it would be as hard to control as it was. Um, and it was, a part of grief that I didn't know what to do with, really. Um, and my brother was so not an angry person. He was very generous and loving and like a gentle giant, and so anger wasn't an emotion I had really seen him demonstrate maybe ever. Even when I was like, I'm 8 years younger, I spent plenty of time bothering him when he was in high school and annoying him. And he never got mad at me. He never got angry. And so it felt, it felt bad. It felt kind of out of control, but it also felt like out of character for me and out of character for him. Like I felt like he wouldn't be this way. He wouldn't be like this. Now, of course he would. If someone else, in our family had died instead of him, I'm sure he would have been just as angry as the rest of us. Um, but it felt very like a very unknown emotion to me. And so I found it very like disconcerting and kind of frightening.
What did you find that worked or helped you kind of soften the edges of that anger?
Time helped, but that's like the worst possible answer. It's, one of the things that we have no control over. Um, Letting myself be angry helped, not just trying to sweep it under the rug, not trying to suppress it or, um, ignore it, but like letting myself feel really pissed off. Um, I tell the story in the book of like breaking all of these dishes in my apartment. I tried that. It didn't help as much as I wanted. But there were definitely like yelling, screaming, like yelling into a pillow and um just it was like I had to get it out of my body in some way. And so crying, yelling, not trying to, I would try to like hold it in and keep it together and be, you know, normal, what I thought was normal, even if I was just like home alone, which was so unnecessary. If you can't fall apart when you're home alone, like you have to be, you have to let yourself do that. And so I think, when I let myself, like, yeah, I'm really angry. I am feeling really angry right now. And I'm just going to let myself feel really angry right now. And, maybe I'd go for a walk. Maybe I'd scream into my pillow and eat nachos and watch Arrested Development, but sometimes it was that like laughing would help. I watched Arrested Development a lot. Um, but I think ultimately it was just letting myself be angry and not trying to deny that was kind of ultimately like the thing that helped me deal with it the most.
Before Ben's passing and growing up, what had been the conversation around grief and death and dying? And, was it something that was openly talked about in your home or, where you could express things? And was it, yeah, what were the beliefs and the things that were kind of shared about grief and death and dying as you grew up?
Yeah, it was talked about, but I also think we were exceptionally fortunate. My four grandparents all lived into their 90s. The my grandpa, maybe my grandpa was 89 or 90, but everyone else was mid 90s. Um, but there were the 2 years I was in grad school, I lost two grandparents, one uncle, and my brother. So it was kind of all at once. Um, but like, I remember the first big loss was when my grandfather died, and I was in seventh grade. Um, and I'm sure we didn't see all of the crying. I'm sure we didn't see all of the emotion, but like my parents, they expressed emotion, they expressed grief. Um, I remember in freshman year of high school, a dear friend of mine whose mom had grown up with my dad, and that was how I knew her. And her mom passed away. She had been sick with cancer for a while, and I remember getting home from volleyball practice, and my dad was sitting on the front porch crying, and he told me, and so it wasn't a taboo subject, but at the same time, we didn't lose that many people, and we didn't lose them other than, Laura, my friend's mom. My grandparents had lived very long, full lives. And it's different, to bury someone in their 90s versus someone in their 30s. Um, and so by the time Ben died, I had lost one friend and three of my grandparents. So grief existed, it was around, but it was different. It was a different kind of grief than this was.
Have you experienced grief experiences since Ben passed and since the book has been written and published? And what have what has been your approach differently now in those experiences, if you've had them? I don't want to assume you did, but
Yeah, I mean, so my grandmother died shortly after Ben, just about 2 months later.
mm,
Um,
the
and
one
I
that
think,
said it should have been
yeah,
me.
yes. Um, and I think in that case, we were all still so deep in grief that it didn't feel distinct in its own way. Um, and I have experienced some loss since then. I have a good friend whose sister, who I knew, died, and there have been some other losses, but none, fortunately, like none in my immediate family or anything that close. I think I've learned a lot about supporting other people who are grieving, and things to say and not to say, and to just show up. um but I yeah, fortunately there has not been a loss as significant since then.
A large theme about your book is the lack of attention that's given to the siblings after a sibling passes. And so I'd like you to share what that experience was for you, things that maybe were unhelpful that people said to you, um, just advice, or not even advice, but just reassurances and things that you would like to share with other siblings who may listen to this who have lost a sibling.
Yeah, siblings are known as forgotten mourners. And when I read that, in some of the kind of academic literature and grief literature, I had this moment of like, wait, so we all know this? Like, what are we gonna do about it? We're just referencing it in passing, and I even asked some grief experts about it, and they were like, oh yeah, yeah, that's what it is. And it's like, but why? Why didn't anyone tell me this? Why didn't I know? And I think ultimately what it is like, people ask about other people and they don't ask about you. So, but you are the in, right? So you're the one that people can ask about how your parents are doing. And maybe how, if the sibling was an adult and was partnered, how's the partner doing, or how are the children doing? And I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with, asking me how my parents are doing. The problem is that people would ask how your parents are doing, and they don't ask how you're doing. So it's not that, you shouldn't ask how someone's parents are doing. It's just, first ask me how I'm doing, then ask me how my parents are doing, right? It's not either or, but
Mhm.
I'm not just the messenger, right? People will often ask the sibling questions that they would not ask a parent, details on the cause of death or things like that, where a sibling might feel like a kind of a safe ally, or, someone who knows all of the dirty details, but isn't the grieving parent, so you can ask them.
Mhm.
And all of those things are just, um, I mean, like you just shouldn't ask, right? If there's a question that you wouldn't ask the parent, don't ask the sibling. If you wouldn't ask the spouse, don't ask the sibling. Don't put them in that position, right? If someone wants to tell you, they'll tell you. Or the advice I like to give is just like, do like a normal person does and just Google it, right? Like, I have tried to Google people's cause of death before. I am a very curious person. I'm a researcher. I have questions. Exactly. We all do it. Just just Google my brother, right? If you want to
2024,
know.
friends.
Exactly. Like just do a little bit of internet stalking, and you might not you probably won't find out all the gory details, but you're going to get a pretty good idea. And I think people, they ask the sibling as if the sibling is fine, but also the sibling has this insider knowledge. So like, let's get the info. Um and I think siblings also, in many cases, and this is not a dig, but I think siblings in many cases kind of intentionally diminish their own grief, because you are watching your parents, you know, completely fall apart. Your parents have just lost a child. They are obviously not okay. Um, seeing them, you know, seeing them grieve can be frightening, especially for, younger people. If you lose a sibling in childhood, folks I've talked to who lost a sibling in childhood or early adolescence describe their parents' grief as being frightening. And so if you see your parent struggling that much, the last thing you want to do is make it worse. You don't want to make them worried. You don't want to, you don't want to be a problem. They have enough on their plate. They're dealing with enough. So you try to be as easy as you possibly can. I think, especially with children, again, that like children, early adolescence goes to like, I'm going to be as easy as I can so that no one has to worry about me and I can just be the easy child. And, people put a lot of pressure on themselves to be that perfect surviving child and to live for both of them, and to never do anything wrong and never cause their parents any pain because they have seen their parent in significant amount of pain and they don't want to cause that. And I think in adult sibling loss, it looks more like just taking care of everything and not putting anything on your parents, never wanting to be a burden, never wanting to seem like you aren't okay, because you want them to believe that you and everything will be okay. And sometimes we're very convincing. Sometimes if you do that enough and you do that for long enough, you can trick yourself into thinking that you're fine. And, the thing that I say a lot in the book, maybe too much, I wondered about this when I was reading the audiobook, if I said it too much, is you can't outrun grief. Like, you might do a really good job acting like you're fine. And then 5, 10 years later, everyone else can talk about your sibling and laugh and reminisce, and you can't say their name without crying. You still feel raw, like it was, a month after they died. And that's what it feels like. Or it manifests in other ways, in in harmful, like, self-coping skills, in other ways that it manifests. And I think ultimately the thing that's most difficult is, like, yes, you do want to try to be kind of easy for your parents, and you do want to, know they can't handle your pain right now, and they can't take it on, and they can't support you the way that you want to be supported. All of those things are true, but you still need to find support somewhere, and you still need to find an outlet. And it's not going to be your parents, because they can't help you. And they can't be there for you in the way that you need someone to be there for you. But you have to find some way to face it and to deal with it. And conversely, you're not really in a position to be your parents' person or your parents' best support. You can support them in some ways, but there's a line where they can't lean on you for everything, because you do need to address your own grief and loss, and you can't do that if you are the primary, emotional caretaker of your parent. And so it's a really difficult position, because the people who are most affected, and the people who know them the best and are probably grieving the most, can't be each other's emotional support in every way. But you can sit together, and you can cry together, and you can talk about them together. You just can't, you don't have enough to give. You don't have enough left to give to really be that for someone else, but you can still be together, and you can still be experiencing it and grieving it together, without having that kind of without trying to, like, put it on someone.
One of the, as I was reading, like, I read the book from the lens of, as a child griever who lost my father when I was 8. And so when you're talking about just the things, what you were just saying, and there, you actually, this is only the second time I came across or heard this word, parentification. And we'll come
Oh
back to that.
yeah,
We'll
that's a
come
good
back to that.
one.
But there were so many parallels between what I experienced as a child griever and what you described as a sibling griever, in the
Mm-hmm.
context of the relationship with the parents. And when one parent dies and the other is living, like, there's so many parallels of what that child experiences, and how you described it as a sibling with sibling loss. So I just want to say, like, even if you haven't lost a sibling, this book can bring up awarenesses and things for you that may not, that you, that kind of surprise you. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was surprising to me, how similar you described that and what my experience was. And you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
this word parentification. Again, only second time I've heard this or seen this word, and it's been like within a short amount of time. So I was like, huh, I've never heard this word. I've been working with grievers for like over 4 years. I a certified grief specialist. I've never heard this term. I'm like, so, but it's when children are pushed into the parent role to be, when it's not developmentally appropriate. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a line in your book that says, I can't take on your grief right now. And if
Oh,
only,
can
if
you? That was a line from an interview, and this woman was saying that her mom was really relying on her, calling her all hours of the day or night whenever she was upset, to talk to her, and that she really had to set some boundaries. And I was fascinated by this, because I was like, "What did you say?" I mean, admittedly, thankfully, my mom did not put me in that position, but I guarantee you, if she had, I would have latched on hook, line, and sinker. I would have answered every phone call. It would have completely drained me. but I would not have known how to push back or set a boundary. And I asked this woman, how, what did you say to her? And she was so, it was like, it seemed like it came so naturally to her. She said, I just told her I can't take on your grief right now. And I remember scribbling it onto an index card, and like highlighting it, like this needs to go in, this has a home in the book verbatim, and it just, yeah, I can't take on your grief right now.
If only, if
Oh,
only.
right.
And being a highly sensitive person, I'm like deep feeler, helpers, healers, like this is when you are, and this is the thing, like this is how like codependency kind of takes root and then just manifests, right? In the dynamics of relationships, when you have either a parent that had passed or like a sibling, and then the relationship with the parent, like this is how this can like just kind of really shift the dynamics of a relationship. It rocks everything. It like this rug is swept from underneath and all that you knew is no more. It completely changes everything. And sometimes it brings out characteristics and things in people that, because they don't know what to do with what they're feeling, it's like got to do something with it. Well, I'll just call my child, and my child can be my therapist,
Right. And my child understands, and my child, all of these things that are, I mean, probably not really true, but like, your child knew this person, they're going to answer your call. They're, it just, they're going to make you feel wanted or needed, maybe, I don't know, but yeah, it came up a lot. It came up in a lot of different people's experiences, this, just the parentification, I think it's the best word for it. It just putting the child into a role that is really developmentally appropriate for an adult and for a parent, and not at all for a child. And I think there's also, this is kind of related but broader. I think there's this like larger cultural sentiment that like, oh, kids are growing up so fast and blah, blah, blah. But they're not, developmentally, biologically, they're not. And so they're exposed to more, they might know more. That doesn't mean they're equipped to handle it, or that they're equipped to handle these emotions. Our brains are not developing at a different speed. There's just more input into it. And so it's, I think, easy to kind of fall into a trap of thinking that your child is an adult because they know big words and they can parrot back these things that they've seen on TikTok. But it doesn't mean that their brain can actually understand or process, or that that they are emotionally prepared and developed enough to handle that stuff and to handle the aftermath of it.
I remind my kids all the time, your frontal lobe is not developed until you're like 25. So just kind of listen to me sometimes. I've been around the block longer than you. One thing I want to get to, and I actually when I was reading this, I was like, ooh, I really want to talk about this. And then I just recently saw one of your Instagram, you had done an interview and you talked about this very thing. And of course, I saw the title and I had to click on it and listen. But you were talking about the stages of grief. So in your book, it's almost as if like you almost believed them. You believed in the stages of grief. And then fast forward to that just recently listening to that interview, it's like, oh no, she doesn't. There's something else here. And so I actually had Ken Ross on my podcast, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's son.
Okay.
That, yeah. But I want to, from your perspective in your grief story and what you were kind of experiencing at the time when you were writing the book, because there was actually a little bit of a delay, wasn't there? Because it seemed like it was 2 years, like towards the end, I can't remember which chapter it was. It was like, I'm 13 years out.
Yeah.
But you're actually 15 years out.
I'm 15 years. So the book, I finished the book at this point I submitted the manuscript a year and a half ago.
Oh,
Because there was like a year where it was in production.
okay.
Um, and I was writing it for about, after it sold until it was due, I was probably writing it for a year and a half, and then it was in production for a year and a half, and I started it even, before I had sold it. So it was really written over the course of a few years. I think I believed so, like, taking a step back, I think the context that we all miss is that the stages of grief were developed in the context of death and dying,
Mhm.
not for grievers, but for
Yeah.
the person who is dying, right? No one ever explained that to me. I thought it was how we grieve, and it's not. It was never meant to be that, right? And so I thought, okay, I'm supposed to go through these stages. And so if I'm not going through the stages, or if I'm going through the stages out of order or whatever, I'm doing this wrong. There was a lot of times where I thought I was doing it wrong. And um, I didn't understand even really until I was doing the research for the book. I mean, when I was researching the book so I knew by the time I was writing the book, I knew that, like, there was something off with either me or the stages of grief, because we
Yeah.
didn't really work together. And I kind of had chalked it up to, like, well, maybe the stages of grief are, like, true for some people, but maybe they're just not universal. And then when I was writing it, it was when I learned that no, actually, they weren't meant for grievers at all in the first place.
Mhm.
So, of course not. But also that now there's, a lot of people who think that it's actually harmful to say that there are these stages of grief, for the exact reason that I experience, which is that it makes people feel like they're doing it wrong, or that, there's only one way to grieve or something like that, which there just isn't. And I think, in the book, I spell out the, in a lot of detail, there are these 15 different, known, acknowledged types of grief. And for me, part of why I did that, everything in the book was something that, like, I found helpful for myself personally. And I think in the case of those types of grief, I found that a lot more helpful than the stages of grief. Because there was a lot more room for interpretation. There's a lot more kind of possible combinations and ways to grieve and ways to change. And um, to me, not only did those resonate a lot more with my own experience, but they also kind of helped debunk this myth that there is one way to grieve, and it is to go through these 5 stages. Because if there are 15 different types of grief that you can experience in combination with each other, in really an unlimited number of combinations with each other, then how could there be these 5 stages that everyone goes through? And I felt like the looking at the types of grief was really more helpful for reflecting on your own experience and giving everyone that kind of weight and validation that their grief, that they're not grieving wrong, that there is no wrong way to grieve. There are perhaps harmful, self-harmful ways to grieve and destructive ways to grieve, but it's all grief. It's not
Thank you.
wrong.
Well, because when I was reading those 15, I was like, wow, this is a lot. And I resonated with some, more than others. And I just thought, you know what, though? I never, even if someone would have shared those with me years ago, that it's like, do you think we're looking for a label to identify with? Like in our grief, like we're just looking, where do I belong and where does my grief fit in the grand scheme of grief? But at the end of the day, none of those are helpful anyway, either,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they're not moving you through your grief. They're not helping you process your grief. It's just a label
Mm.
of the type of grief. So at
I
the end of the
think
day, grief is grief. Grief
yes.
is
And I
grief.
I think the label is helpful because it makes you feel like you are not alone, and you are not, I don't want to use the word crazy, but like you're not doing it wrong. You're not alone, right? If there are enough people who have experienced this thing that they've come up with a name for it, then I'm not the only one who has ever felt this way. And I think it's that. It's knowing that you are not alone, knowing that you are not losing your mind, knowing that you are not, reacting in a way that no one has ever reacted before, or that you're overreacting or underreacting or whatever. I think the thing about a label is, if there's a label on something, then you are not the only one who has ever experienced this. There have been enough people who have experienced this that someone gave it a name, and that can be really validating. So, and I think in some ways it can help you figure out how to move through it, because maybe you can figure out what the thing is to work on, but maybe then you work on it and you fall into one of the other, like it's all going to be a lifelong process. It's never going to be like fixed. But I do think, especially for siblings who feel like their loss and their grief has been ignored and diminished to begin with, it's really easy to feel like you're overreacting, or you're doing this wrong, or you're not really supposed to be grieving, or any of these other things. And so the label gives validation to the emotions you're feeling, even if it might not, give you a path, or like a step-by-step plan to follow. It makes you feel less alone, and it makes you feel less like you've lost control of your mind.
Can we talk about forgiveness?
Yes.
Okay, so I am curious if you, in your research, ever heard of the book, The Grief Recovery Handbook?
No.
Oh.
Or maybe I've heard of it, but I don't think I've read it.
Okay, well, this is me going through the handbook. I'm like a researcher too, right? Like, oh, I can do this myself. I can go through this process myself. Yeah, no. I became certified grief specialist after I realized I couldn't do it myself. But I want to talk about forgiveness, because I'm curious if that has shifted for you a little bit since the book has been out. Because when you talked about it in your book, it was as if it's like a gift you give somebody else. But what I've learned is that forgiveness is a gift I give myself.
Uh-huh.
So I'm curious if that's shifted for you, or if maybe that's a perspective that you hadn't considered before.
I don't think I struggled with forgiveness as much as a lot of the people that I interviewed and spoke with. There were people for whom forgiveness, often because of the cause of death, or, the things that led up to it, forgiveness was a big ask. And forgiveness was something where, hearing their story, I can't help but always kind of imagine myself in that position. And there were some stories where I thought, I don't know if I would have gotten to forgiveness, or could have gotten to forgiveness. And so but I found myself being extremely, I found the forgiveness that people gave their loved ones to be extremely admirable, and I would think, I don't know if I could have forgiven, but the fact that you did is incredible to me, and it feels like such a gift. And I think, yes, it's a gift to the other person, but this is a terrible thing to say, but if you've read the book, I again have very little filter. They don't need your forgiveness because they're dead, right? And I do think that even when people are dead, they're around us, and their spirits are around us, and we can feel their presence. But I think that by the time you're a spirit that's around us, you also kind of don't need our forgiveness anymore. Like, hopefully they know what the purpose was and they know the greater meaning, and they probably look at us and think like, you'll get it one day, you know? And so I think forgiveness is for us.
It
I
is.
don't think forgiveness is for them. You know, I don't think that my brother, wherever he is losing sleep or, you know, worried that we're not going to forgive him. I think he sees a much bigger picture than we do. But I think it's easy for us to lose sleep over giving that forgiveness. So I do think that forgiveness is, when it comes to grief, you know, forgiveness in life, something different. But when it comes to forgiving someone who has died, I think it is a gift that we give ourselves, not something that we do on their behalf.
Well, and the thing is you're never going to get an apology, right? They're gone.
No, you're never going to get an
No,
apology, and they're never going to be like, thank you so much for forgiving me.
exactly. So you're
You
stuck in
know, like,
emotional jail. You're stuck in emotional
yes,
jail until you
yes,
can do that for yourself.
yes,
And that's why it
yes.
is. Yeah. So in this book, this is what it says. Forgiveness is giving up the hope of a different or better yesterday.
Mm, I like that. Giving up
Any
hope of
memorized
a better
resentment, yeah,
yesterday.
any memorized resentment of past events will limit and restrict our ability to participate fully in life.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
forgiveness is an action, it's not a feeling. And it is possible. I've done it,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
you know.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
read this book. Definitely
I
recommend
will.
the book. I think it will give you, and then reach out to me and let me know what your thoughts are. I'm really
I
curious.
will. I
Um,
will.
sorry if you can hear my dog barking.
That's all right.
One of the interesting things I found in your book too, key points I want to bring up is you talk about one of the hardest things about sibling loss is accepting that the departed sibling existed in only one phase or part of the surviving sibling's life. And it's like as if like you know that it's like they're frozen in time in this phase of your life, and all the phases that are to come, they're not a part of it, and how they know your childhood like nobody else and can fill the gaps. And that struck a chord with me because, you know, I'm 9 years younger than my sister, and she's already
Mm-hmm.
been filling the gaps for me for many
Yeah.
years. Like, you know, because she obviously remembers more than I do about certain things. And um, I loved how you were called Sklaver Kitten in the book too, because you know my sister is Veronica and I'm Victoria, and she's always been Big V and I'm Little V, so we kind of have that. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would like you to speak to that, just that how that's kind of a consistent theme that you saw in the research that you were doing, and maybe in your own experience.
Yeah. You know, I think going back to kind of how we started this conversation and talking about siblings as our longest relationship, you know, they really, biologically, they really should be our longest shared relationship. And that the your siblings, you know, are part of your life before any kind of adult partnership forms, and they continue in your life past the death of your parents, traditionally, right? Typically. And so they're just always there. You always expect them to be there, right? And you always expect, you know, you said your sister is 9 years older than you. And so your sister should always be 9 years older than you because she has always been 9 years older than you.
Mm-hmm.
My brother was 8 years older than me. So I'm now older than him, which is not the way the world should work,
You
right?
referenced wanting to skip your birthday in the book.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's like, you know, that internet meme, like the math doesn't math. Like my brother is 8 years older than me, but I am older than him.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just expect that they will always be there because they always have been there, and because that's the birth order and that's how that works. And so it's hard to imagine. There's I write about this in the book, that there's like a link between the part of our brain that we use for imagination and the part of our brain that we use for memory. So it's hard to imagine something if you don't have a memory of it, and kind of vice versa. They're connected. And so I don't have, I didn't have a memory of a world that he didn't exist in. And so I couldn't imagine a world that he didn't exist in. It didn't logically make sense to me because of the way our brains are wired. There's a very like clear reason why that connection wasn't made. And for me, I just always assumed my kids would know their uncles, and that, my brother always wanted kids. I assumed he would be a dad, right? I didn't think I would hit those milestones without him present. I didn't think I would hit milestones that he never did. And it really forces you to literally rewire the synapses in your brain to understand the world in a different way. And siblings create their identities, compared to and in opposition to each other. And so they're such a central figure in our identity development and in who we are, and then they're gone. And it's really hard to center yourself again, and to figure out how everything now fits together with that key piece that's missing. Again, even if it's a bad relationship, maybe your whole identity development has been based on the fact that no matter what, you do not want to be like your sister. Then you do everything different than your sister. Your sister is still a linchpin in that identity development. So when she's gone, when you're not anchoring yourself on making sure you're different than her, then who are you and what do you do? It's hard to even imagine it, because it's just such an unknown world. And getting older than them is a real, I don't know if you were at that point with the loss of your father, but I've heard the same thing from people who've lost a parent, that becoming older than your parent can feel very disorienting.
It was, actually, he died when he was 44.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like turning 44, for me, I couldn't experience that year without knowing or feeling like, now imagine if I was given 6 months to live. You know what I mean? Like putting myself in those shoes and imagining myself like my father and his experience. And he actually lived like 16 months, but and turning 45 and being older. Yeah. It's those dates, right? Those milestones that they don't stop, even 30 plus years out, they don't stop. And so this brings me, it's a good segue into, because we're kind of getting short on time, but I want to bring this up because I think it's so important. It's a huge undercurrent in your book is music. And, how important music was to Ben, how important it has been to your healing throughout the book. Song lyrics have been huge. And then I get to the end of the book and you mention, I'm like, what? Indigo Girls was his favorite band. I was like, what?
You were in the military. That has to be rare, right? That there are soldiers whose favorite band is Indigo Girls.
I actually texted a girlfriend of mine your book, and I said, I just finished this, and she just said at the end that that Indigo Girls was her brother's favorite band. And I thought of her because she and I have spent so much time in high school, even after, like, we're still friends, cruising down the road, singing. Like, I had the alto part, she had the soprano. Like, I've seen them in concert. Like, I think I even have a good guitar pick that they threw out. Yeah, so I was like, what? Like, I don't know, like he would have been like I feel like he's like a kindred spirit some way. Um,
Can
just
I
how
tell
you
you?
described him and talked about him and through the music and all of that.
Can I tell you a really good Indigo Girl story that happened after the book?
Yeah.
Um, so Indigo Girls were coming to New Haven, which is where I live, and this was last August or September, so just about a year ago. And I bought tickets to go with three of my girlfriends, and one of the first concerts I had been to was Indigo Girls in New Haven at this concert venue called the Palace. So it's approaching. I get the edits back from the publisher, and they are due the same day as the Indigo Girls concert. So now the Indigo Girls concert takes on even more weight because now I'm like, okay, I need to hit send on this before the concert, and this is going to be our celebratory concert. So I get the edits in, everyone's excited. My girlfriend's everyone's excited. And I'm telling them about this first Indigo Girls concert I went to, which my brother Sam was also at. We all went through Indigo Girls phases. And I was telling them about the Palace Theater, and I was like, I don't think it even exists anymore. And we walk into this venue, and I was like, this place looks like the Palace. And I Google it, and it is the Palace Theater, just new management, and they changed the name. So now I realize I'm at the same, venue where one of my first concerts, Indigo Girls, all of these things. And I was like, I'm going to get something from the merch table. And we're standing in line at the merch table. And I say to my friend Dana, I wish there was something that was like a piece of merch that was like symbolic of finishing the book and, getting the manuscript in. And she says, you mean like that t-shirt that has a bookcase on it? And their swag was like banned books, and it was like the t-shirts had these bookshelves on it, and the front pocket looked like a library card pocket. So I get the t-shirt, walk in, the whole set is these oversized bookshelves with books on it.
Oof.
And then they start playing, and they start playing one of the songs that I have in their book that starts with, that's a newer song. I hadn't heard it before, but the first line of the song is, "Oh Annie, I am sorry for your grief." So they start playing that song, which is kind of a like B-side, like deep track, right? I'm crying. And I said to my friends, if they do Power of Two next, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm probably gonna faint. And sure enough, next up they play Power of Two. And I am just bawling, and it was like and I talk about this in the book that like I was a bit obtuse to signs for a while. I was not really open to them. And eventually, once I kind of realized that my brother had been like beating me over the head with them. And after Power of Two, my friend was like, so can we all agree that this was a sign? I said, yes. Yes, I feel like he's here. And it was this like amazing moment where I felt like he was at the concert with us. I felt like he was at the concert with us, and I felt like he kept being like, Annie, I'm here. I'm still here. Don't write this off. I know you're going to write this off. Let me just give you a little bit more proof. This is me. It was like again and again and again. And it was just amazing. It was an incredible experience. And it felt like very much a culmination of everything I had been working on and, everything that he had loved. And yeah, it was just incredible.
I have chill bumps. I have chill bumps. It truth bumps, I'll say. Yeah, if that's not a sign, holy crow.
Exactly. By the end of
in the book you talked about with the little blue flowers, and I was like, whoa, that's pretty good. So you'll just have to read the book, my friends, to know that one. But I'm glad you went there about the continuing bonds because depending on how you grow up and what your beliefs are. And, maybe as a child, you weren't taught that, hey, you can still talk to your loved one. You can still talk to your sibling. You can still talk to your dad or your mom or whomever passed away or your childhood
Mm-hmm.
friend. We aren't, or your pet even, right? Like children, they totally bond with their pets. We just aren't taught that bond can continue. And I think as adults we kind of pass our beliefs, whatever they are, onto our kids. And so if we don't
Mm-hmm.
believe that, we believe when you die, you just die and you go in the grave, and that's all that there is, then of course that's what children will believe. And you don't
Mm-hmm.
know that continuing bonds is possible, and that can be really healing for people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think growing up, I'm Jewish, and growing up, I kind of was taught or believed that there's a heaven, but there's not a hell. Like Jews don't have a hell. And so um I thought there was a heaven that everyone went to, but I didn't think there was like any kind of connection between life on earth and whatever's going on in heaven. So like when my grandfather died, when people died, I imagined them like off in heaven, hanging out together, having a blast. But not that there was a back and forth or that there was a connection. And I think obviously I eventually got there, but it was like I was halfway there, but I didn't really I didn't really think there was a relationship between the two so much, but now I do.
Well, and you talk about how that came about in the book too, and so people will just have to read the book to find out. So I'll
Yes.
just keep plugging the book in that way. Um, but yeah, I and there's so much more I could talk about, but I know you have to get going. But I just want to thank you for this work that you put out in the world. And again, like even if you haven't lost a sibling, if you've lost somebody else in your life, there's something you can glean from this book. Um, and again, I have more things that we could talk about, but I want you to give you an opportunity if you want to share something that you don't feel you got to, that you feel is important.
Good question. No, I think I've loved this conversation and all of your questions. And I think, the only, I think the biggest message is just that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to grieve your sibling. It makes sense that you're grieving your sibling. And, I want people to know that they are allowed to, that they are, that they don't need to be stoic and they don't need to be okay. And it's, it's okay to also grieve. Um, and yeah, yeah, I think that's the takeaway.
What comes to my mind, I get this visual of like, when you kind of shrink down and you get small because the grief around you of other people is so big, and you kind of just make yourself small, and it's almost like you just got
Mm-hmm.
to go like this, just make room for it, make room for
Yes,
grief.
yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
Where can people find you, find your book? Where can they connect with you? All the things. I'll put the links in the show notes, but I'll have you share that as well.
Yeah, so they can find the book, Always a Sibling, anywhere books are sold. And you can find me on Instagram at Annie Sklaver Orenstein, my name, or annieorenstein.com. Yeah.
What are you working on now?
Uh, I don't know. I really want to write something else, and I'm trying to figure out what comes next. What's the next idea? I have too many of them, or perhaps not the right one. I don't know, but working on figuring out what comes
I love that. I have another. I wrote a book too, and a self-published though, and I know I have another book in me, but it hasn't like just landed. You know what I mean? Like
next. Yeah,
you
yeah.
wake up one day and you have a book title, and it's like, ooh, I got a book title, and
This one, people ask like, how was I able to do it? Because I have a full-time job and kids. And it was like, well, but I had to. Like, I don't know how I did it. I just knew I had to do it. And I need that. I need to figure out, what's the next one that I have to write. And I'm excited to figure that out.
You made it a priority. And that's the difference between, I mean, everybody has 24 hours in the day. It's what you prioritize in those 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I got up at 5:30 every morning. That was just my writing time
Exactly.
because that was
Exactly.
important to me. You make time for what's important.
Yes. And I need to find that next thing that matters that much, because that's also when I would write my book, but it takes a lot for me to get up early. I hate it. I kept waiting to start enjoying it or to become a morning person. It has yet to happen. But clearly, if there's a good enough reason, I will do it. So I am exploring possible reasons to wake up early.
Well, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this book.
Thank
And
you. Yeah, I will
thank
pick up
you
a
again.
copy.
Thank you
Of
again. And,
course.
we'll stay connected online, I'm sure. So
All right. Sounds good.
remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.